you. Good evening, everyone. My name's Neil, and I'm an astrophotographer. I was asked to have a little talk to everyone tonight about my astrophotography for the AGM, and I thought I'd take it from the perspective of telling my story as an astrophotographer from when I first started looking at and taking photos of the stars to now. And in doing so, I thought I'd be able to cover some of the changing technology over the last 20 odd years, and the lessons that I learned, some of the small steps that I took on the way to the skills that I have now, and some of the giant leaps that made a big difference in that change, or in my abilities. And while doing so, I'd like to perhaps teach you a little bit about astrophotography and how to be able to take photos yourself. So I'm starting off with this slide, which is showing two photos of Orion that were taken 26 years apart. So this one here, this was taken, I think when I was about 16 years old, on an SLR camera, 400 ISO film, trying to get things focused and long enough to get a shot. And I was amazed to be able to just get that. And the one on the right was taken 4 or 5 months ago through my telescope, with all the skills that I've learned since then. So it wouldn't necessarily take you 26 years to get to that stage these days. The digital revolution has made a huge change in the way things are done, and you can learn and improve so much faster. So the first photo is this is the full photo of the crop you saw before. Many of you will recognise the constellation of Orion. It's one of my favourites. It was one of the first ones I wanted to shoot, and with the help of my dad, who was an amateur photographer, he taught me how to try and get a shot. He'd never done night sky photography, but this was my first attempt, and I was very, very excited to be able to get this. And as I said, it was when I was 16, and it sort of cemented for me, not this particular photo, but the idea of being able to take photos cemented for me the excitement of capturing the sky. But on film, it's very difficult. It can be expensive because you can't see any mistakes. And so I never really got into astrophotography in a big way back then. I stayed an observer, and in fact I made a telescope myself. This was another photo I took about the time. I was learning a little bit more, longer exposure, so it's a little bit brighter. You can recognise the Southern Cross. But yeah, light pollution is a big problem, and I'll show you this just from my backyard. So yeah, I got the bug, and I made my own telescope. This was back in the days when I was a member of the Astronomical Society of Victoria, and Ken and Perry. Ken especially was instrumental in helping me learn how to do this, so grinding my own telescope mirror. That's the tube assembled without a mount, so I was mostly observing at that point. I ended up putting it into a Dobsonian mount, so not really appropriate for astrophotography anyway. That's me and my dad. Some people here who are in the ASV might remember Dad. And we even made it into the newspaper around the time of the Comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 impacts. The newspaper called the ASV and said, "Who have you got that's young that we can put in the newspaper?"
That was me that said that.
Oh, was it? Thank you. I have to thank you actually, because that was leading into Naomi, my now wife, coming along to the observing night when the comet hit Jupiter, and that's where we first met. So,
well, hopefully, yes, you don't blame me for that.
We've been going for a good long time, yes, that's all right. Okay, the digital revolution got off to a slow start for astrophotography, for me anyway. My first digital SLR, my first serious digital camera, was the Sigma SD10, and it had a diabolical performance in low light. This is what a 30-second exposure looked like under dark skies in Tasmania. That's not light pollution you're seeing yet. That's the actual sensor. It was terrible. I saw that, and because I'd only had the camera for a month or two at this point, and this was the first time I was under dark skies, and I was itching to give it a go, because I remember back when I was 16 how exciting it was. This is worse than that photo. So I kind of lost my enthusiasm again for a little while, and I didn't take any astro photos until probably the first leap in my astrophotography. I got myself a Canon SLR. It was the 350D, and I believe the next photo was showing my first attempt with that. That is, again, not much better than my first attempts as a teenager, but it is far better than the Sigma. Having that ability to take photos like this, now that meant that I could learn. I could start with take more photos, see how they worked, see what worked, what didn't work, and build from there. This is, again, a 10-year-old plus camera. Just about any high-end compact mirrorless or any digital SLR can outperform this, can run rings around this. So any one of you can just stick your camera on a tripod, point at the sky, get a rough focus and get a shot like this. So I want to try and encourage everyone to think that this is accessible. Anyone can try astrophotography. This was probably one of my first successful shots. I was a big fan of fisheye lenses, and I still am. I love my fisheyes, they're great fun. And this shot was taken on a trip in New Zealand at the Church of the Good Shepherd. And as you can see, the fisheye distorts things quite a lot around the horizons, and it distorts things around the edges there. Now that is not actually star trails from the star movement. It's from the distortion of the fisheye lens, and because at that time I was still very new to astrophotography, I didn't have a remote cable release. And what that meant was that I was limited to 30-second exposures, but I wanted to get longer to get more of the stars. So I actually had the tripod down at this lowest level, so it wasn't going to shake as much as it could if it was extended. And I held my finger on it. I held it for a count of what I thought was about 2 minutes. And that let me get this shot, and it's not too bad. I wouldn't recommend ever doing this yourself, holding the finger on the shutter. One of the main reasons why it didn't totally ruin the photo, except for the edges there, was because as a fisheye, it's a super wide angle. And when you're shooting at wide angles, you've got less, or you've got more freedom with movement. If you move a little bit, it's not going to affect the image as much as if it was zoomed in, because the zooming magnifies the camera movement as well as the subject movement. So if you're zoomed at, say, 200 millimeters, which is a moderately long focal length, and you bump the camera a little, it'll wobble a lot in the field of view. But on a fisheye, it doesn't move nearly as much. And I was actually very fortunate. This was the first astro photo I sold. This was used as a double-page spread in a Discover magazine special on the universe. So that was a big encouragement for me to continue. But as you can see, there were problems. That was taken on the same night. Again, I didn't have the cable release, and I tried using one of my longer focal length lenses. Again, trying to shoot the Orion Nebula. As I said, Orion's my favourite constellation, so I was always trying to shoot it, and you can see quite clearly, every star there looks like a little V. You just cannot hold the shutter, or hold the camera without making blur during a shot, especially if it's zoomed in. I did have some other successes though.
Neil, what about a timer on the camera?
You can do a timer, yes. The problem with using the self-timer is that you're limited to the maximum shutter speed on the camera, which is usually about 30 seconds. And with this lens, which was the kit lens, which was a slow lens, slow meaning it doesn't have a big aperture and couldn't collect a lot of light, and being the old 350D, it didn't have fantastic sensitivity, so I needed to get the longer exposure than just 30 seconds. At least that's what I felt at the time when I was looking at the screen. So yes, the Comet McNaught, a number of years back, that didn't need long exposure. That was so incredibly bright, and I expressed that with doing a little bit of light painting with my phone screen. So having events like this and having some success taking photos of those kept pushing me forward. But again, I was still having troubles. This was trying to get a photograph of the Milky Way and star trails. So you're going to get lots and lots of photos like that for every photo like this. Again, more fisheye shots. This was taken at a local park in Blackburn. I think it was actually not Blackburn, Gels Park. And that was really my first shot with the Milky Way, which you can see there. But it was in Gels Park, so you got a lot of light pollution, and the moon was up. At the time, I wasn't really aware of how much of an impact that has on your photos. Light pollution is a real killer. So shoot when the moon's not up, or it's a very thin crescent, and shoot away from the city. Another attempt at the Milky Way, again while the moon was up, but I thought I'll take it anyway and I'll use some foreground stuff to make it sort of an artistic shot. And it kind of worked. It's a photo of the stars over a house. Again, doing it on the night without a moon, I had a bit more success. Once again, here's my favourite Orion up here. I actually managed to capture the large and small Magellanic Clouds, and you can see the Milky Way fairly clearly through there. I also experimented with doing a bit of light painting in the house as a foreground, and it wasn't great, but it's okay. It made an interesting photo. At the time, I was pretty pleased with it. I thought, that looks great. But I knew that I could do better with more practice. And around that time, I was trying new things, and I discovered that it's not just about star trails that are challenging, it's also focus. Focus is really difficult with night sky photography because it's too dark for the autofocus to work. And at this point, this camera didn't have live view, which is a function that allows it to display what the camera is seeing on the screen before you take a shot. That's the way I focus now, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So I had no idea whether this was in focus or not when I took it, so I'd have to take a photo, see if it was in focus, change it a little bit, take another, change it a little bit, take another. A difficult and tedious process that usually didn't work. Some more fisheye shots, love them. This time I managed to get some decent Milky Way going on. I think that was probably the first decent Milky Way shot I got. Still had a moon here, but it was low to the horizon, and I don't think it was a very full phase.
Where was that from?
That, I think, might have been Mansfield. So I had decent dark skies, but there's some towns around that put a bit of glow on the horizon for the light pollution nearby. As I mentioned, getting out away from the light pollution is going to make a big difference for the quality of the images, but it's still going to be difficult to get so far away that you won't have any of the glows on the horizon. You'll always probably have something like that, unless you go out to the Mallee or something like that. More attempts to get the galaxy. This time zooming in, and focus was good, but star trails. Star trails were really my limit. I wanted to get closer to things. I wanted to make them bigger. Fisheyes are great, they look cool, but it's always the same shot because you're taking the whole sky, and the only thing that changes is the time of the year. But I wanted to get closer and get more detail on some individual subjects and take different individual subjects. So this was probably around the time I had my next big leap in skill. And that was thanks almost entirely to my friend Phil Hart. Some of you may know him. He's a very skilled and quite highly awarded astrophotographer. I would say that he's one of the best in the country. He's won the David Malin Awards. I think he's picked up something in a category every year for the last 6 years. He's an excellent astrophotographer, and he taught me a lot. We were both members of the Astronomical Society of Victoria at the time, I believe. And he took me out to the night sky up at Heathcote and showed me his telescope, which made me very jealous, and taught me a few things about exposure, and because he has been doing astrophotography way back since the start. When I quit with film, he didn't. He kept going. He made barn doors, which used to try and track the stars a little bit. He would make very complicated and weird-looking devices covered in wires and gears to make fantastic photos. And for a long time, he was someone I really looked up to, and I still do. And he was a mentor for me, and he taught me a lot. And at this point, I would say was the second big step in getting into astrophotography. And so my lesson to you from that is to find a mentor. Find someone that you respect and whose work you admire, and ask them for help. I'm happy to help any one of you learn astrophotography. If you see me out there in the observing field on members night and I'm taking photos, chances are I've set up an exposure sequence and I just leave the telescope alone. I don't touch it, so I'm free to help others. Ask me, find others, ask them, and you will learn so quickly.
Neil, could you just explain what a barn door is? Do you mean something when you open your garage, or what? Kind
of, but shrink it down till it's about this size. Put a worm screw gear on it that is connected to a motor, and the motor is timed so that if you had the worm gear was a complete circle, it would cause the worm to revolve the barn door around the whole gear in 24 hours. Essentially, it moves at the same speed of the Earth, and if you can align it roughly with the South Celestial Pole, so 38-degree inclination pointing south for Melbourne, then you will get it roughly tracking the sky. So if you're using a short focal length, a wide field of view lens on a moderate length exposure, say 1 to 2 minutes, then you might be able to avoid star trails. And that's something you can make yourself, but these days you can buy stuff that's that's fairly cheap as well. So this is sort of an example of the fruits of my tutelage from Phil. This was using a 50mm, again on the 350D, and I was shooting it at the maximum ISO, which is very noisy. but I'd learnt a bit about post-processing. I'd also learnt to, because I was using my Nifty 50, which is a fantastic lens. It's a Canon lens, and there's other brand equivalents, but it's a 50mm f1.8, and because that's in a sweet spot for optics, it's fast, it's sharp, and it's cheap. So if you're just getting into astrophotography and you already have an SLR, I recommend getting a 50mm f1.8 lens as your first astro lens. It's still going to give you some issues with star trails at 30 seconds, but because it's so fast at f1.8, I was able to take this in 10 seconds. A 10-second exposure can get you an image that looks like that. You can get the dense clouds of the stars in the Milky Way. You can get the nice dark Coal-Sack Nebula. You can even pick out the different colours of the stars in the Southern Cross. So if you don't already have that lens, it's a very cheap lens. It's under $200. It's been as low as $100. And if you've already got an SLR, then that's a great way to start. Just a tripod, a good lens, and the SLR. And as I said before, all SLRs are probably better today than this one was then. I've mentioned that I love fisheye lenses. One of the cool things you can do with fisheyes is create 360 degree by 180 degree or spherical panoramas. I was experimenting a lot with panoramic photography, and I wanted to try a night sky one. This was one of my first attempts, and I was very pleased with how it worked out. The distortions you can see around the top here are as a result of the sphere being stretched out. This is a kind of like Mercator projection of the globe, where the continents, the far bottom, north and south of the map are stretched out. The same thing happens to the stars. This is meant to be viewed inside a sphere. And it's a pretty cool result.
Neil?
Yes?
When we get our new dome,
Yes?
if we project that on the inside of that?
Theoretically, yes. You might get the telescope in the way of the projector, but if you could arrange some way to have the projector, like maybe a pair of projectors opposite each other, you could sort of blend them together, that could work. But yes, I don't see why not.
We've got connection with Swinburne University, who pioneered the use of data projector, spherical mirror, and warping technology on the laptop driving it, so that you could project onto a ceiling.
That would be very cool. I've always wanted to see my panoramas in a planetarium or something similar, but that I can imagine would look quite good. So yeah, let me know when you come to do that, because I'd love to participate. Yes, another question?
How did you actually take that picture? How did you get it to be 360 like that?
Okay, that is a good question, and I'll go into it. I didn't want to take too long. I didn't want everyone to be too bored, but just quickly, using a tripod, obviously you need a tripod to keep the camera still, and using a specialised piece of equipment called a panorama head. The idea of the panorama head is to rotate the camera around the no parallax point in the lens. That means that as the camera turns around, it's not changing the relative position between a near object and a far object. So if you look at your finger at this distance, you blink your eyes, the finger moves relative to the background. The idea of a panorama tripod head is that it doesn't cause the camera to shift side to side as it turns around. So I took, well, typically I take 6 photos around and 1 photo up. For this one, I actually took 3 photos, 30 seconds, at each of the 6 points to blend them together to try and reduce the noise, and then stitch those 6 together in software. Using a fisheye, I was able to get all the way up to the zenith and most of the way down to the nadir. So I just had to put black down there because I didn't capture the ground. So it's a combination of a wide lens, a panorama head, and software. So making progress, trying to remember at what point this was. This was, I believe, when I was using, taking several photos and stacking them, but not actually using a tracking platform. When I say stacking, what that means, you have noise in any camera, and as you increase the ISO, the sensitivity, that's essentially dialing up the volume, the digital gain, you're amplifying that noise as well as amplifying the signal. Well, alright, you're not amplifying the signal, you're amplifying the output from the signal you collect. You want to try and reduce the noise while increasing the signal. That's tricky for a number of reasons, and so one of the tricks, one of the ways to get around that is to take many photos, because noise is typically random. At least a major contributor to the noise in photos is random. So if you take more than one photo and you blend them together, the signal, which is constant, amplifies, and the noise, which is random, averages out. So the more photos you take, the more you increase the distance between the signal and the noise. So you're increasing the signal to noise ratio. It's tricky to do. It took me a long time to learn, and some of my first results were okay, but not brilliant. But it's really probably it's the next biggest step I took, but it was something that took me a while to learn and actually get the results from.
Neil,
Yes.
with previous shot there, how many shots would you take to get that? You know, is it
That
like-
one I can't remember, but I would guess, because I wasn't tracking, that'd be at maybe 30 seconds or even 20 seconds, because that's looks like it's about 50mm focal length, or zoomed in a bit. I would have probably taken 10 or 12 shots at that
Yeah.
time and then blended them together. This area of the sky, particularly the Eta Carina Nebula and this part of the Milky Way, is quite bright. So it's relatively easy to get a high signal to noise ratio in a small number of exposures. The alternative, of course, is to not even bother with taking many exposures. It's just to take one big long one. That way you can turn the ISO down so the noise is not as apparent, but then you get issues with different kinds of noise. As you can see down here, this sort of noise isn't as a result of random fluctuations. That's as a result of variation in the manufacturing of the sensor. So every pixel is slightly different in its efficiency, and so you get noise that doesn't average out. And that's something that's tricky to get rid of, and I'll come back to that. Yes.
On that image,
Yes.
why on the right-hand side are the star trails?
Broken.
Yeah.
Because
it
cloud was passing
Oh,
through, and so at some points the star was obscured. Yeah, you can see sort of like Morse code effect, and that's as a result of the star sort of blinking in and out of the clouds. Fortunately, we didn't have cloud elsewhere in the shot, but you can sort of see a murky yellowish area down there. Oh, and if you're wondering down here, that's just me and Phil walking around with our red lights. At the same time, that night when I mentioned I was out there with Phil, I was lucky enough to have the chance to stick my camera on his scope for a while. And the difference that you can get with a tracked camera or a tracked telescope, with the camera hooked up to a big mirror, it's huge. This is something I'd never been able to take before, and it got me excited, but again, just made me jealous because I couldn't afford a telescope, and especially not the kind of telescope that Phil uses.
Neil,
Yes,
was that 40mm Cardi or what?
I believe that's the Omega Centauri.
Oh,
So not
Oh,
as
okay.
compact as 47 Takane. Another shot that I took through his telescope. Little bit of motion there. I'm not sure if that was his telescope or me bumping or something like that. Chances are it was my fault, not Phil's.
Go back to that shot, please, Neil.
Sure.
One of the things that most photographers don't do when they shoot Eta Carinae is they leave out the pyramid cluster at the bottom
Down
right.
here.
Yeah,
Like
just
this one?
yeah,
Yeah.
which is just one of the most beautiful little clusters you'll ever see.
Yep.
So
It's
good
a
shot.
challenging one to add though, because it's, as you say, it's quite, well you didn't say it's quite bright, but it is it's outstanding constellation. It's difficult not to clip the bright stars, meaning not to overexpose the whites. It's also a long way away. This is a huge field of view. So it's hard to fit all that into a telescope field. You probably need to use a long camera lens rather than a telescope. But Phil, he loves his wide field stuff, so this is a wide field of view. So again, practicing more with the fisheye, getting better with post-processing here. Again, another one of those things that it was a giant leap, but it was more of a long, continuous process in learning how to take what I've captured in the camera and work with that data to make it look its best. When it comes out of the camera, it's often very yellow because of light pollution. It's often very murky and low contrast, and it's lacking color. So in post-processing, you can fix the faults and the flaws, and you can have artistic license in the way you present that data. it has to be said now, or at least the way I do things is astrophotography is equal parts science and art. Many astrophotographers are purely focused on the science. They don't care if they get a good image, they want to collect good data, even stuff that they can contribute to NASA and the scientific community. I think we've got some members here who do that. But a lot of other photographers like myself just love creating beautiful images that sort of capture the awe of the cosmos. And in doing so, it's a big part of subjective eye and creative license. And for a long time, I was processing my photos very blue because I liked blue stars. It took me a while to get through my blue phase, and now I'm processing more to have more of the natural colours. But even so, I do like to enhance the contrast and saturation a bit. This was probably my best galaxy shot up to that point. I was now shooting with a new camera at this point, and that was probably the next biggest leap for me. And I think the previous photo also was with that new camera. It was the Canon 5D Mark II. And if you know anything about Canon cameras, the 5D Mark II was a bit of a revolutionary camera. It's increased the capability of the sensors dramatically, and at the same time in a form and price that was far more accessible. So many people, many professionals and sort of serious amateurs were shooting with the 5D Mark II, and it was also quite an excellent astro camera. It had high sensitivity, low noise, and very good colour. And that allowed me a lot of latitude in post-processing. With my post-processing skills, I was able to create a shot like this that is far more natural and shows far more detail. And so even today, I'm still quite pleased with that shot. I think that was quite a nice shot. Again, I continue to take photos of the galaxy, so one of my favourite subjects. And again, shooting wide, you don't have to worry about tracking, at least nowhere near as much.
So, Neil,
Yes.
previous one with the house lights on,
Yep.
I presume you had to have the house lights off for a period first?
That is the house lights off. What you're seeing there is basically, I think it's Phil's monitor, or the TV, and maybe a candle or two in the house. This was on, Phil and I, or I should say, Phil ran a series of astrophotography workshops, and he invited me along as an assistant. Phil would conduct the daytime tutorials, and at night Phil and I would share the work of assisting the students to focus their cameras, choose their subjects, get their settings right, answer their questions. And when we were doing our photos at night, we would keep the lights down low inside the house. But low lights in a house are glaring broad daylight compared to the Milky Way. So even having low lights in there would cause it to be completely overexposed and blown out inside the house. So that's showing you how sensitive these cameras are and how dim these subjects are, and why you need to get away from light pollution. But as always, I wanted to get closer, I wanted to take more detailed shots. I thought I could make this shot work by having some, foreground elements of the trees overhead, but the trails just are too much. It's not going to work in anything other than a tiny, small size photo that you can't see. You can see the trails there. It looks like the camera's been bumped, but when you zoom in, you can really see how much of a difference it's. They're about 10 times as long as they are wide. They should be small, much smaller than that. So, and is this? Oh no, this is just having some more fun with the fisheye. That's Phil, and that's myself, and this was our students on that particular class.
They look like
And this particular photo, actually, I was very fortunate to be awarded the David Malin Award for the category for that year, the creative category, which was People and Sky. And so that was a significant photo for me because of that award. This was another fisheye shot taken at the same location, I think the same night, and I was trying to get some reflections in the water, and that came out fairly nicely. And this photo was taken, I think it was on the next workshop, and that one actually in the same Malin Awards was given an honorable mention, so that was a good year for me. Oh, this yellow down here, that's light pollution from Melbourne, and this was up at Lake Becklock. Lake Becklock, yes. When it had water. Again, trying to make things interesting by putting stuff in the foreground. I quite like this shot. Again, you can see the colour in the stars, and you've got some of the detail in the Milky Way. You can't really see it at this scale, which is fortunate, but there are still star trails. I think this might have been a 15-second exposure. It was a little bit later on that I got the 5D Mark III, which again was not a big leap, but a significant step forward. You do what you can to try and make interesting shots when you have wide field only. And this was the next big step. I invested in a piece of equipment when the bug was biting too hard and I was getting too frustrated with having the star trails on zooming in subjects, and I bought myself a star tracker for cameras. Can someone just turn the lights on for a moment, please?
Mind your eyes.
So, when you're getting into astrophotography and the bug has bitten you and you want to get in closer and take photos of subjects that are a bit more interesting, a bit bigger and not just wide field, this is a great piece of equipment to have. It's essentially a small equatorial mount for your camera, and I purchased this one for $450 Australian, including shipping. And what it does is you've got a little, I'll have to take this off first, you have the camera on the top, but through the centre you have a little polar scope, and through a combination of the left and right adjustments and the altitude adjustments, looking for the polar scope, you can align to the south celestial pole, and in doing so it has a little motor inside which you can control the speeds with this, which is now off. It's got just 4 AA batteries, and that then rotates the polar axis around by drive. And the drive will run at the speed that the Earth runs, and so it will track the stars to some extent, not for very long and not extremely accurately, but long enough to be able to let you take, say, 2-minute exposures or more with 50mm, or if you've got one of the beautiful Canon 135mm f2 lenses, that is a beautiful thing on this. So you can adjust the camera any way you like. I should actually explain, this is my tripod. The bigger, sturdier, heavier tripod you can get, the better. I know it's a pain to carry, but sturdier means less shake and better star shapes, less trails or wobbles. And this from here to here is the tracking head, and this is the tripod's ball head. So when I'm shooting with this, I take the ball head off the tripod and put it on the end there, and that means that I can then point the camera anywhere in the sky. And once I've found my subject, lock it off, turn on the rotor, or turn on the drive, and that will now rotate once every 24 hours, tracking the sky. And that, as I said, allows you to take much longer exposures with much longer focal lengths. And again, it's all relative, but you can get far better results than you could if you're just shooting on a tripod. Right, once again, please.
Neil, how does a polar scope work in the southern hemisphere?
It's got a little map inside the polar scope,
Yep.
which shows both Polaris and the Sigma Octans asterism, the little cluster of stars that
Right.
we use in the south celestial or southern horizon to align to the south celestial pole. It's also got a little attachment that has a light on it that you can put in the front to illuminate that, so you can dim the light to see the stars and then turn it up to see the alignment guide.
Sure. Thanks.
And that was actually how I learned to polar align. Polar alignment, you've probably heard, is difficult, and you've heard right. It's quite frustrating, and it took me several attempts, the first few tries, to get close, and I had some failures, but once I learned how to do it, it made a huge difference, and I'm glad I'd learned on that, because with my telescope now, it's I can get polar alignment within, say, 2 minutes, 3 minutes of looking through the polar scope. So this is some of the results that I was able to get with a bit of tracking. That's not tracking, but it's a bit of fun. You can see the sort of things you can do without tracking. And this was another favourite photo of mine, Milky Way over the Lake Bonnie Doon. Insert castle jokes here. And this one I was also fortunate enough to be awarded the category prize for the David Malin Awards this year.
You're dreaming.
The CSIRO shared this photo around the time of the Malin Awards on their Facebook page, and with the caption, "This one's going straight to the pool room." So it was around this time that I got the tracker. So it was also around this time that my wide field sky shots started not being taken anymore.
Neil,
Because-
was that late in, sorry to interrupt
Yep.
there, just hold that thought.
Hmm.
Late into the night or early evening for that shot?
Probably around 11 p.m. in August, late August. It was actually up there on holiday for my birthday with friends. You can see the sort of purplish light over here. That's the house we stayed in. They had these fantastic festive coloured lights outside, and we left them on. And my friends were all over there. I had a couple of people come with me, but most of the friends were back inside there at this very moment watching the castle. So this was one of my very first attempts with the tracking platform. This, some of you may recognise as the Rho-Ophiuchi Nebula Complex in Scorpius. You can probably see, or if you've got a keen eye, you may see the corners chopped off in the photo. And you probably can't see, but if I zoom in, oh, okay, if I zoom in, you can see there's still a bit of trailing. And the reason for the chopped off corners and the trailing is because my polar alignment wasn't quite right. I still hadn't figured it out by that point. And that meant that as it's aligned the images from multiple images in the stack, each time it aligned it, it was slightly different in position. And that meant that the picture overall shifted, which caused the corners to be chopped off. But I was very, very happy with the results of this, considering that I'd never, ever previously been able to get a close-up photo of a nebula where the nebula was bright and colourful. And so this kicked my passion up another notch. Good old Ida Korea. Again, I've probably over-processed that at the time. I was still learning processing techniques. And I overexposed the centre as well. But it's a learning process. And these ones I was much happier with. I took a couple of, I think there are 135mm focal length photos of the Milky Way core. Got a couple of the nebula there. I think that's the Cat's Paw Nebula, and I'm not sure what that one is.
It's at the end of Scorpius, that's...
Oh yes, there's the
Yeah.
Scorpion's tail.
Shola and whatever. So to the left is Sagittarius and M8.
Yep. And another core shot, and there's M8 there, isn't it? Down here, just in the corner. It was hard to frame through the camera when you can't see anything but the brightest stars, and you don't see the results until you actually take a photo. Again, one of the challenges of astrophotography. But I did still take some wide field stuff. This was not long after I moved to my new home in Emerald, taking a photo of the Milky Way over Emerald Lake, and I actually used the star tracker for this one. It has a feature that allows it to turn at half sidereal rate, which means that it's splitting the difference between the blur and the ground and the sky. So it's moving at half the rate the stars do. So I took a 60-second photo there instead of 30-second. Let me get a bit more exposure without having to worry about the ground being blurry because I'm tracking the stars. So the next biggest leap for me was in learning some advanced post-processing tools. You may or may not, if you're an astrophotographer, you may have heard of the software package called PixInsight. One word, PixInsight. It's a dedicated specialist astrophotography processing software tool. It's incredibly powerful, but it's also got a very steep learning curve and a relatively hefty price tag of about $300 US. But it allowed me to take photos that started out like this as a single exposure, taking multiple stacks and then blending them together to end up with this. Now, this isn't a hugely spectacular photo, but for the first time ever I was able to capture the Horsehead Nebula, which blew me away. I had no idea I could even do that with my camera. I managed to catch up here the Witchhead Nebula, which you can probably see is very appropriately named. And you can even see around the Orion Nebula some of this faint, fuzzy, brown looking stuff, which is all faint nebula. And I had no idea that was in my photos. When I saw this come out of the post-processing software, and even by then I hadn't learned how to do that very well, I was blown away. And I did this on the trial, and the day after I saw this, I bought the software. And that's probably more than anything up to this point has had the biggest and quickest change or effect in the results of the photos that I'm putting out. Astrophotography is not a cheap hobby. If you can get started really cheaply and really easy. It's one of those things that's simple to learn and difficult to master. Well, it's also cheap to learn and expensive to master. And I did a crop of that and can get into some detail there. It's not hugely detailed, but you can really see that there was a lot more captured in that photo than you see at first glance in the wide field. That was a 50mm focal length.
Exposures?
I can't remember exactly, but that would have been several 30-second exposures. I'd imagine at 3200 ISO and at, I think it was actually 70mm f2.8. And I would have taken probably 20 or 30, so maybe half an hour total exposure.
Nice view of the horse head.
Sorry?
Nice view of the horse head.
Yes, I'm quite pleased with that. I was very happy with that at the time. This was my cover photo on Facebook for a good number of months. Then, this was probably one of the most significant photos in my astrophotography life. That tracking platform I showed you before, it's capable of carrying, it says 5 kilos. I thought, that's ridiculous. I tried it with my telephoto lens on there. I put a 50 to 500mm focal length telephoto. I tried it just for fun. The first day I got it, everything was wobbly and shaky and terrible. I thought, I'm never going to use that lens on here again. Well, I was out with some friends under dark skies, and I thought, I'm going to show them what these nebulae look like up close. It'll be a bit blurry, but they won't care. They'll want to see it. And I gave it a shot. I did a 2-minute exposure at 500mm. It didn't come out looking like this, of course, because this is the post-processed version. But I could see the Orion Nebula. The stars were small, and I'm thinking, my God, I can take photos with the 500mm. So I continued to take a series of them. When I got home, I realised that actually it wasn't quite as good as I'd thought. I had to throw out half of the photos that I took, but that meant I had half of the photos that I took. And when I processed them and put them all together, I got this. And I'm still proud of this shot. It's not the best shot I've taken of the Orion Nebula so far, but it's probably the most important shot for my astrophotography career. And it is this photo that persuaded me to buy a telescope. Or at least, it didn't persuade me, it convinced me. I had to persuade my wife to let me buy a telescope. And there it is. So this was probably the last big leap I've had. Buying a telescope is, well, it's a huge difference from shooting with the camera alone. The mount and legs are really the difference. The telescope is great. That lets you do stuff that you can't do with the camera. But if you had to pick between the telescope and the tripod and mount, get the bottom half. Because you can stick a camera on this at 500mm and get rock solid pinpoint stars because the tracking or the stability of the mount is so good. However, I was very lucky. I was looking through some classifieds, astronomical sites called Ice in Space. They had a classified section. And I was looking for equipment that would suit me for astrophotography. And I happened to be lucky and find a guy who had recently had a child, who was an astrophotographer and suddenly ran out of time. And he decided that he had to sell some of his gear, not all of it, but he put his astrophotography kit of this telescope and everything I needed to get started online as a listing, and the total new cost of all the gear is between $4,000 and $5,000, and I managed to pick it up for $1,800. So that's not cheap. $1,800 could feed you for quite a long time. But as things go, that was a fantastic price for the equipment that I got, and it let me take the next big leap. And now most of my astro photos are done telescopically. I still do wide field stuff because that's fun, but it lets me do things I've never done before. So the first night I got it out under dark skies, I went a bit crazy. I took photos of, I think, maybe 5 or 6 different subjects. All of them were just sort of single shots because I was learning how it all worked and setting it up took a while. But that's a single photo. That's not stacked. That's just a 2-minute exposure of Eta Carina. That's the Rosette Nebula. Again, just a single exposure. You can see how much noise there is. But again, the PixInsight post-processing software has got fantastic tools for increasing the signal-to-noise ratio, getting rid of the noise in the background.
Was the scope an 8-inch?
It's an 8-inch f4, which in photography terms is an 800mm f4 lens equivalent. It's a good, fast f4 telescope, and 8-inch is a good compromise between size and price and light collecting ability. This, I believe, is 47 Tucanae globular cluster. And of course I had to shoot the Orion Nebula, Orion being my favourite. And these were all single shot exposures, and I thought, okay, I've done my tour of the sky, I want to see what I can do by taking multiple exposures. Again, I had a lot of problems and I was still learning. I couldn't get my chroma corrector to fit with my camera. A chroma corrector is a piece of optics that you put between the camera and the telescope, which fixes some of the aberrations that you get as a natural result of having a parabolic mirror. It means that the edges, the corners of the frame are not brought to the same focus as the center. A chroma corrector fixes that. I couldn't get it to work with my camera. I couldn't focus the camera in when the chroma corrector was installed, and so I got these bloated star shapes in the corners here, as opposed to the sort of the much smaller ones there. So I was cropping in a lot to try and avoid that, but I still wanted to try what would look like with multiple exposures stacked, and that was the last photo I took of the night, and I was pretty excited by that result. I see a lot of faults with it. There's a lot of things that need to be improved. There's a lot of noise down here. The nebulosity around the star here is a bit blobby because of the noise filtering. The chroma corrector still wasn't installed, and so I've got a lot of bloated stars, but it's still pretty. I'm still really pleased with that. Yes?
Would a dark frame help with the
I
stuff?
did take dark frames.
Okay.
Yes, but not enough. So yeah, that's some of the more advanced techniques of taking photos with the lens cap on, essentially, and capturing the noise in the camera, and then you take that photo or a series of those photos blended together and subtract that from this, and that gets rid of that camera noise that I was talking about earlier, the pixel variations. This was after I'd learnt a bit more. I had learned how to take better calibration frames, such as the dark frames. I'd managed to get a better result with the chroma corrector. As you can see, the stars are a lot smaller, still not as small as I'd like, but better. And this is a photo of the running chicken nebula.
Where's the chicken?
That's what everyone says. Everyone sees a chicken, but differently, in different places. I won't say where I see it because I've almost been an hour already. Gosh. My first galaxy shot. Tried this with the Barlow lens. I realised that makes an f4 into an f8, which means it's much, much slower, so I get much less light. But look, it's a galaxy. Taken with, equipment that costs less than an old beaten up used car. First attempt at Jupiter. It was nice to see the red spot and the cloud bands, but it also made me realise that this is not a telescope for planetary work. This is a wide field telescope. You can get planetary shots, but this is nothing compared to what I've seen many astrophotographers take with their planetary specific equipment. Probably one of my favourite shots so far, Eta Carina Nebula. I'm sorry, Perry, your favourite star class is just out of frame, but a
Look
telescope...
at the rest of it, Neil.
I know.
Magnificent.
The telescope has a much smaller field of view than a camera, so again, I see lots of faults in this image, things that can be improved, but I'm not going to point them out this time. I'm very pleased with how the photo came out. I like the colours, I like the fact that I managed to get the nebulosity detail in here without blowing it out, and still get some of this faint stuff, so I'm pretty happy with that one. That, incidentally, was taken in a heat wave in summer on a night of 30 degrees minimum. It was the hottest night of the year, and that is not the right time to be doing astrophotography. As I mentioned earlier, heat equals noise. I think I mentioned that, I should have. The hotter the camera, the more noise there is. I probably could have gotten twice as much signal to noise ratio in the same time if the temperature was more like 10 degrees instead of 30. So again, I'm pretty pleased with the results. The Omega Centauri again, this time telescopically, I can get much more detail, and I was very happy to be able to get many of the stars in the middle resolved without them sort of blending it together. this is my best Orion shot so far. Again, I see many faults, but isn't it pretty? I took this here actually, NBO, and I only managed to get half an hour of data before it sank below the trees. So again, a little bit of noise here. It's also blown out in the centre. Orion Nebula is a tricky subject to shoot because it's so bright in the middle and so faint at the edges. So I need to improve my techniques to capture that full dynamic range, but it's coming back, so I'll have a chance now. Again, the Rho Ophiuchi Nebula complex, but zoomed in close. Still problems with it, but I love the colour. You don't often see yellow nebula, and I'm happy with the colour I managed to catch in that nebula. This was another small step forward in my technique. I was using what's called a guide camera, which is a second telescope and camera that sits on top of the telescope. It watches a star, sees if it moves, sends that information to a laptop. The laptop analyzes the movement, says, okay, it moved this far in one direction, I've got to correct it back the other direction, sends that information back to the telescope mount, and it corrects it. It does that every 2 seconds or even less. And what that does is it allows you to get rid of any minor errors as a result of the gear in the telescope drive being slightly imperfect, or from small movements from the wind breezing, or the sag of the telescope changing as it tracks across the sky. And that allows you to get much smaller and tighter star details, which if I zoom in, you can see those stars are pretty small. That's probably my sharpest detailed star photos so far. That's the Ptolemy cluster in
M7.
Scorpius. M7, yes. And I think finally, this is my most recent photo. I love galaxies. The problem with galaxies is they're very, very small and very, very faint. From the previous shot, you could see that that is immensely dense with stars. This is not nearly so dense, partly because it's not in the Milky Way, so it's out of the plane and there's fewer stars to look at, but also because this is heavily cropped down from the original photo, so you're sort of zooming in to where there are less stars to see. It's quite noisy. I didn't have enough time to collect data. Again, I had to finish shooting before I wanted to. But I was able to do some decent post-processing and bring out a lot of the dust lanes, the dark nebula, which is what you see when you look at the Milky Way, those black ribbony things across the Milky Way. They're lanes of gas and dust. Well, I managed to capture them in another galaxy here. That's the Sculptor galaxy, M83, I believe. And that's my most recent photo. And
NGC 253.
Yep.
Is that what you mean?
yes, I think this is. This is me at work. So this is what it looks like when I've got my telescope set up. This is the guide scope, which is running down from this cable connected to the laptop, which then runs down this cable and goes back into the drive. At the top here, I've got a foam roll on the end, which is essentially a dew heat or a dew shade, a dew shield, and that helps stop the dew forming on the optics of the telescope. That was a lesson I learned when I got my photos back at the end of the day and saw half of them were all blurry because there was dew on the mirror. Essential piece of equipment here, a thermos flask full of tea. You've got to keep yourself warm on these long cold nights, and these nights can get very cold. I had one night where I had one of my boxes covered in dew, and by the end of the night it was covered in ice crystals. It wasn't a freezing night, it didn't actually get down to zero, but when you're out in the open and there's just sky above you, that heat just goes straight up into the sky, and so the local temperature is a lot colder than the measured air temperature for the area. So I've only been shooting with my telescope now for maybe 8 months, and because the weather has been so diabolically terrible this season, I've only actually been out probably shooting a dozen, maybe 15 nights. I have so much to learn, and I think there's so many improvements that I can make to my work, but I'm also encouraged by the fact that I'm getting photos that are, even though technically flawed, they're aesthetically pleasing. So that wraps it up. Does anyone have any questions? No,
Neil,
I've been thorough.
yeah, no.
Yes.
Are you shooting, is that at prime focus or?
Yes, yeah. The camera is mounted on the side here, which is where the eyepiece is.
Yeah.
There's no lens in there. The
Yeah.
camera is just mounted directly onto the eyepiece,
Yeah.
the focuser.
Yeah.
So the light just comes down, hits the primary mirror, bounces off the secondary and out the side, and
Yeah.
focuses
Yeah.
on the camera sensor.
But you mentioned using a Barlow earlier.
Yes.
And that So you just
You put the
Yeah,
barlow
yeah,
in
yeah,
between
yeah.
the camera and the eyepiece.
Yeah.
And the focuser.
Yeah.
At the moment, I've stopped using the barlow. I tried it once, and I
Yeah.
realised it makes it much slower and darker.
yeah.
Because it magnifies the image, it also magnifies any flaws in the image.
Yeah.
So any movements and stuff, it makes the stars lumpy. And it's a long thing. It sticks out way further, so that makes
right.
the
Yeah.
telescope a lot more difficult to balance. It doubles the magnification, but it quadruples the difficulty. Yes, very.
Neil, some of your work there is fantastic. I really enjoyed the talk.
Thank you very much.
And I know you've put an awful lot of hard work into preparing your shot, preparing the location, doing lots of trial and error to finally get just the right shot, especially in your wide field shots.
Yes.
What do you think of these photographs that the internet seems to be littered with, of people just putting in a Milky Way into an ordinary shot, or sticking the moon in somewhere where it doesn't belong? Give us your candid opinion
My
of that sort of
favourites-
photography.
My favourites were last month during the supermoon, and
Yeah.
everyone went out to try and take photos of the supermoon and realised it wasn't so super. And so I saw a whole pile of posts in astrophoto groups saying, "Here is my interpretation of the supermoon." With the Photoshop giant moon over a skyline or stuff like that.
Big Ben or something.
Yeah, that's right. Look, as I said before, it's equal part art and science, and I don't think it's my place to say that art is less important than science. So if it looks beautiful and someone loves it, then that's great. They can create whatever digital fantasy they like, because frankly, this is digital fantasy too. It doesn't look like that to the eye. You look through an eyepiece, you go, faint, blurry, black and white. It's not what I'm shooting. I'm shooting stuff that doesn't look like what it is. I'm just enhancing it beyond reality. However, I really don't like it when people post these things and sort of either don't say what it is or imply that it's natural. I don't like it when there's, a giant, picture of the moon and the moon never gets that big. Or I don't like it when they put these black hole swirling cloud things in these photos with people in the foreground pointing at them. You see in all these sort of aggregate sites. So that frustrates me, but again, it's hard to criticise because it's artwork.
Well, when
People make art how they want.
they have the super moon next door to the Southern Cross, all this crap.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there's a lot of artistic license.
It may be hard to criticise, but it's reasonable to criticise the thing you're owning up to.
Yes, I think if it,
that's the criticism.
yeah,
If you've done a picture that you
if it's digital art, I think it should be described as digital art.
that.
It sort of takes a bit away from the hard work I put in to get a photo that's real. When someone can just slap a couple of things together in Photoshop and it sort of looks as good.
But also, it sets up unreal expectations for people who don't know the difference.
Yes,
They
it does.
then go out and
Yeah.
expect to see something that the people who do know the difference know you never see that way.
And actually, speaking of unrealistic expectations, I hope that my talk tonight has actually shown you that I have taken some photos that I'm very happy with, but I wasn't always able to do that. In fact, it's only been recently that I've been able to take the photos that are that sort of wow result. I hope that encourages you to think that it's not that far out of reach. The wide field stuff is very easy to do. It's beautiful results you can get, and it doesn't take a lot more effort to go past that with a 50mm lens and shorter exposure times, or a little bit more money to get a decent tripod and a star tracker to get some of those closer shots. That Rho Ophiuchi Nebula one, that was just a standard but expensive Canon lens and the tracker. You don't need a telescope to get that close. I want a telescope because I want to get closer. So I'm hoping that some of you now, having heard my talk tonight, will see that's not quite as hard as I thought it would be and give it a go yourselves. And I've been thinking lately that perhaps there might be, if there's enough interest, we could perhaps start up an astrophotography section at Mount Burnett Observatory. So if anyone be interested in doing that, I'd be happy to hear your interest.
Well,
Yes.
we have astrophotography as part of our deep sky nights.
As part of the Deep Sky, okay? Then I'd be happy to get more people involved with that.
I could have done with you here last week because I was trying to set my telescope up and I could not get it to pull
I'm sorry, I had a photo shoot. I had to do something else. So, all right. Any other questions before I start with something like Lightroom, which is the Adobe software, and you can use it for your daytime stuff as well. Lightroom is available in a bundle with Photoshop for a subscription of $10 a month. A lot of people don't like the fact that it's a subscription, you don't own the software. But I think getting two pieces of software that are worth together maybe $3,000 or $2,000 for $10 a month is a great deal. Photoshop and Lightroom are amazing pieces of software, and you can use it for your daytime photography as well. If you want to go a bit further, you can experiment with stacking with something called Deep Sky Stacker. It's free, it's got a steep learning curve, and the results it gives are okay to good. You need to learn a lot about how it works in order to get the best results. But that just stacks the photos, including calibration frames. So it gives you the result which you then process in Photoshop or Lightroom. But if you are serious about astrophotography and you want to have a package that does the whole thing, I highly recommend PixInsight. It's not cheap, as I said, but I mean, you pay more for a good eyepiece or a good lens, and the results, it took my photography to the next level. I would say more than anything else I've done, except perhaps the telescope, it was the biggest improvement I saw in my astrophotography is buying and learning how to use PixInsight. Yes?
How long would you normally take to do your post-processing?
I'd probably spend maybe 1 to 4 hours capture data and probably about the same time in post-processing. It varies a bit depending on the subject. Some subjects are quicker because they're simpler, like the galaxy. It's just a galaxy, you don't have to worry about preserving background details, bringing out the really faint nebulosity and such. But there is a lot of time spent in post-processing, and a lot of it is invisible time, like creating your calibration frames. That can take hours, and you don't actually get anything from it. You just get a file that you use to calibrate photos that you take later. And it's also a lot of to and fro. You process it, you think about it, you look at it, and you walk away for a while, come back, and you think, oh no, that's too pink, I've got to fix that. And it's a fluid process. It's not necessarily something you can sit down and say, okay, step 1, step 2, step 3. It's a lot of backwards and forwards. So I would say typically it'd be 1 to 4 hours of post-processing. Sometimes it can take longer, sometimes it can be, but really it can be quicker. Anyone else? No? Okay, great. Well, I hope I haven't gone, oh, I've got one more back there.
That's an Apple computer, isn't it?
No, that's a Dell. The round thing here is the Dell logo. If it was Apple, it would be glowing.
No, I'm looking at the illumination on the thermos flask. Who else but Apple would put a torch on the back of the screen?
that is just the screen. Actually, the thermos is past the screen. These two lights here are from, that one is from the...
Batteries.
Not quite the battery. That's what allows the telescope, or the computer to talk to the telescope. It's got a little LED on the box. And this one, I believe, is the power cord LED. It's got a little LED on the end of the power cord, and that's illuminating it. Because this is a long exposure, it makes it look very much brighter. My face is completely blown out from the screen, which is turned down to the lower setting.
Makes you look younger though.
So when I'm your age, I'll just take photos and make my face white. Just paint it
I
white.
do that all the time.
You should be a geisha, Perry. All right, well, thank you very much for your attention. I was supposed to speak for 20 minutes, and I've got an hour and 10, so I hope that wasn't too long.